This is ABC Fora.
So let's try to follow the money through the smuggling industry. The first question to ask is, how much do smugglers charge? Again, based on research in Afghanistan and Pakistan, costs vary significantly according to the destination to which you want to go, assuming you're leaving Afghanistan or Pakistan. In general, the USA and Canada, North America, are the most expensive, and Western Europe and Australia are roughly the same amounts of costs, cheaper than going to North America. Costs also vary by mode of transport. Looking, for example, at Afghanistan to Australia at the moment, to fly between Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Australia illegally with a smuggler will cost you something between $12,000 and $15,000 US dollars. These are not insignificant sums of money. To do it by a combination of flight then boat, perhaps a boat from Indonesia, will cost you somewhere between $5,000 and $8,000 according to going rates at the moment amongst migrant smugglers in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And let me just make two observations of those costs and that range of costs. Firstly, smuggling is a flexible business. Smugglers will deliver a service that suits the depth of your pocket. If you can't afford to go to the USA, I'll take you to Turkey. If you can't afford to get to the UK, I'll take you to Australia. If you can't afford a flight, which is probably the safest way to go, then I'll make it cheaper and we'll do a combination of flight and boat. This is a business. You're a customer, and I'll find a way to get your business and to get your customer and to get your money. If you're poor, don't worry, we'll find a way to make it work. If you're richer, let's do it by flight, go straight to the USA, and things will be straightforward. It's a business, and I think we need to think of it in those terms. And the second observation I'd make is that I think almost by definition, given the amounts of money we're talking about, smuggling does not involve the poorest of the poor. These are people who, as we'll see in a minute, at least have the wherewithal to raise loans, perhaps to sell property. They have the wherewithal to be able to raise the money that's needed to pay these rather large and exorbitant fees. Having said that, I had a very interesting debate yesterday with Julian Garside on another panel, and he made the point, and I think it's important to emphasize here, that we shouldn't underestimate, especially in the Australian context, that many people are still coming from very underprivileged and very poor backgrounds. And I take that point completely. My only argument is that given the costs involved, these are not the desperately poor of the world. These are not peasants. And I think when we come back to perhaps to discuss the global financial crisis, that's an important implication. There may be more people who are desperate to leave poor parts of the world. Whether they can afford to, paying smugglers, I think is another matter. So there's the first set of issues, how much families need to raise to pay smugglers in the first place. Let's look now at how migrants and families raise the money. The first thing to say is that in almost all the cases of people I spoke to, both in Afghanistan and Pakistan, it was families, not migrants themselves, who raised the money. Very few migrants have the money either in savings or the wherewithal to raise the money themselves, and they rely on families and family networks. This is an investment by families in their children. Just as you might invest in sending your children to school or university, these are families investing in their children, either to get them out of harm's way, if they're fleeing persecution, or to help them perhaps to achieve a better life and a better standard of living by getting them to another part of the world. Again, think of it as an investment, as a business. How did families raise money to pay these large fees to move their children around the world? Some people drew on savings. Some people sold property. Some people were selling jewelry. Some people sold land. Many people took on debt and borrowed money from money lenders. And let me just go back especially to the jewelry point. Anyone who knows the Islamic culture, who knows Pakistan and Afghanistan, selling your jewelry is a fairly significant thing to do in these parts of the world. This isn't something you do lightly. These are wedding betrothals and so on and so forth. These are significant investments, that's the point. You're selling land, you're selling property, you're selling jewelry, you're taking on risky loans from unscrupulous money lenders. This is a business, and you expect a return on your investment. This isn't something you take on lightly, I think, in any of these countries. On average, across my sample of over 100 people in Afghanistan and Pakistan, smugglers' fees came to 367% of annual household income. So what I'm saying is that people somehow raised more than 3 times their annual income in order to pay for smuggling. So again, an investment upon which people expect some sort of return. You don't just take on borrowing 3 times your household income for the sake of it. You do it because you expect some form of return upon that investment. Next question. We've seen how much smuggling costs. We've seen how migrants and normally their families raise the money to pay those costs. How are smugglers paid? And I think this is among the most interesting of the findings. Anyone in this room who's used eBay will be aware of what an escrow service is. An escrow service is a company that holds a buyer's money until the buyer is satisfied with the goods that have been delivered, and then the escrow service releases the money to the seller. So you're not risking paying all the money to a seller who's going to sell you a dodgy hi-fi, which means you don't get the goods that you want. On eBay, you deposit your money with a third party in escrow service. Once you're satisfied with what you've got, the money is then released to the person who's selling you the item. Exactly the same system exists today in smuggling in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Migrants' families don't pay the money directly to smugglers. They pay their money to a third party, usually a money changer or a money handler, normally in one of the big bazaars, either in Peshawar or Kabul. The money is only released by that third party to the smuggler once the migrant has arrived safely in his or her destination. Now just think about what I'm saying. What I'm talking about here is a money-back guarantee on smuggling. If you don't make it to your destination safely, I, as a smuggler, get nothing at all. Nothing. The money is taken from the third party, from the money changer often in the market, and goes back to the family, and let's just call the whole deal off. A money-back guarantee on migrant smuggling today in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Now, this varies around the world, and you'd find slightly different responses in West Africa and South America and so on and so forth, but I think that's quite a striking and important finding that we might wish to come back to. It's interesting briefly to look at how payments have evolved in this setting. About 5 to 10 years ago, the method was that all of the money was paid up front to the smuggler. So if you wanted to move to Australia, you would come to me, the smuggler, you'd give me the money up front, and you'd hope that I was trustworthy. Often I wasn't. I ran off with the money. You didn't move. You lost your $10,000. Again, a business responding to criticism by the customers, that soon changed. For a couple of years, the method was that you'd pay a proportion of the money up front. So you'd give the smuggler, say, 50% of the money, and you'd pay the balance upon confirmation that your son, and it normally is your son, has arrived safely in the destination to which he's going. The problem with that is that it opens up the possibility for exploitation. You arrive in Australia as a migrant, you still owe $2,500 or whatever it is to the migrant smuggler back at home, and that debt means that you can be exploited. You can be forced into prostitution, you can be forced into exploitative situations, and so on and so forth. And this is where the concept of migrant smuggling and human trafficking begin to blur into one another. Again, in response to complaints from potential customers, that changed, and we now have what is effectively an escrow system, a money-back guarantee, a low-risk investment for families. The money is deposited with a third party and then released once someone has arrived safely in the destination to which they're going. So we've seen how much it costs, we've looked at how families raise the money, we've looked at how the money is actually transacted and passed over to smugglers. Let's look briefly at how smugglers themselves spend the money. I think it's really important when talking about smuggling to move away from a kind of generalization, which I think we all have, and it's understandable, I think, especially given the press, a generalization that somehow smugglers are arch criminals. They're some sort of James Bond-esque baddies who are kind of in the middle of this cruel and evil network of manipulation and evil. That may be the case in certain circumstances, and I think the so-called snakeheads in China probably do fit that James Bond sort of model, but in most places in the world, they don't. Smugglers who move people from Mexico to the USA are so-called mom-and-pop industries. There are a couple of people who move you across the border in a fairly low-tech and fairly straightforward way. In Pakistan and Afghanistan, it's normally people who have completely legitimate jobs and are making a bit of money on the side. So the normal contact usually in Afghanistan and Pakistan is a travel agent. He'll close the door at 5 o'clock on his business, he'll take you downstairs, and you'll start to discuss other issues, more illegal issues perhaps over the table. He will then work through a network of people to make smuggling happen. And again, this echoes something, I think, a very interesting discussion we had with Julian Garside yesterday. We need to get away from the idea that smugglers are always evil. In some cases, in some circumstances, smugglers are people who are helping people get out of harm's way. Oskar Schindler was a smuggler and so on and so forth. We know those kinds of ideas. So I think we need to have a bit more sophisticated idea of what smuggling is and who smugglers are.
This is ABC Fora.